Hi, I'm Randy Cantrell. Welcome to the Year of the Peer podcast with Leo Batari. This podcast is based on a simple truth. Who you surround yourself with matters. Author and keynote speaker Leo Batari will interview thought leaders from all walks of life who will share how they leverage peer advantage and show you how engaging your peers more purposefully can hold the key to greater success in business and in life. Today's guest is Laura Goodrich. For over 20 years, Laura Goodrich has built her reputation as an innovator, speaker, coach, and advisor for leaders across the globe. Her powerful, distinguished voice has acted as the rallying cry for organizations, both big and small, to embrace change and face the future of work. The culmination of Laura's work can be seen in her book, Seeing Red Cars, which Forbes called a must-read for leaders who desire positive change in their organizations. In addition, Laura has pioneered and produced microlearning lessons and programs to help clients at creating a mindset for change. Let's get started, Leo.
Hey, Laura, great to see you. Thanks for being here and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited about this conversation, Leo.
Well, one of the things that's so great, of course, it was a number of years ago that I became familiar with your work, Seeing Red Cars. I actually saw the video first. Then I read the book, which was really wonderful. And I know since Seeing Red Cars, your work has just really taken off and really just evolved so much, and especially with all of the, I think, tireless efforts against really understanding the dynamics around workplace change and all. But I think to start, it would be great to just have you talk a little bit about Seeing Red Cars, because it's kind of how we first became acquainted, and also talk about its relevance to the Year of the Peer and what that looks like for you.
That's a great question. Thanks. Well, I've spent over 20 years working with leaders and organizations that are leading through change, charged with really being those leaders of change. And when I started working with them, I would ask them to share the change with me. And then I asked them the question, well, in light of this change, what do you want? And without a moment's hesitation, they would begin telling me about all the things that they didn't want. In fact, all the things that they were hoping to avoid. And I would say to them, we get more of whatever we focus on, just like when you buy a red car. And that's where the concept of red cars came from. And it was one of those reoccurring themes that almost happened 100% of the time. And what we came to learn through that process is that unconsciously we focus on what we fear and what we're hoping to avoid. And I think the critical word there is unconscious, right? We don't recognize that we're doing it. So when we started doing that work, and we saw a couple of things. One is that if an environment is really dynamic, the change environment is really dynamic, that fear-based reaction is exacerbated. And two, and you mentioned the term observation, because we've really, more than anything, have just been keen observers of human behavior, asking a lot of questions. So for many years when we did this work, leaders would say, that unconscious focus on fear is problematic. But in the last few years, they say it's a lot more than problematic. In fact, it's paralyzing them. And that's what we're finding today in our conversations with leaders. And what frankly just scares them to death is that they're making small changes and they're getting such resistance to small changes. And that has them saying, what's going to happen when we make a big change? Because if we see resistance, huge resistance to, let's say, new ergonomic chairs, which is an actual example, or different garbage receptacles, if we see resistance to those kind of things, what's going to happen if we have to really change in the marketplace? What happens if we get disrupted? And we really have to do an about face and find a new way on a new road. What's going to happen to us then? And that really gets down to this underlying fear right now that many leaders have is, that we don't have the agility built into our organization to enable us to steer toward opportunities and create them.
Well, and I want to get back to this point about our kind of unwillingness sometimes, or maybe our inability to communicate what it is we really want as opposed to what we don't want. I mean, you and I have talked about Peter Senge's work and about how people oftentimes neither feel capable nor deserving. And it's really kind of a cultural thing. And when we talked about it in the context of peers, sometimes it's also, we're not always surrounding ourselves with the kind of people who we'd be comfortable really just putting a stake in the ground, saying, here's what we want. Here's what we want for ourselves. Here's what we want for our companies. So I'd love for you to talk a little more about why is it that we are so reluctant to just say what it is, what it is we want to do?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really important piece, and I also think it's important to distinguish who we're talking about, because we've certainly found that owners or CEOs of organizations are much more confident in making those statements. It's how they operate, and they recognize the need. It's their employees and the people that work for them where this really comes into play. And in many of the senior leader facilitations I've done, they're kind of befuddled by that reality because it's just not the way that they think. Most entrepreneurs and senior leaders have had recognized that without that type of clarity, that it's really problematic. And they have a higher level of confidence in themselves. And so to step back and to say, well, what if this is very difficult for your employees? It really does require them to take a step outside of themselves and to develop a sense of empathy for those that they support and that work for them.
So do you see it sometimes as between senior level and more junior level, or do you also see differences with regard to generations? Because I know you've done a lot of work in terms of the number of generations we have in the workplace that are working side by side now. So is it easier for either baby boomer or millennial to say, here's what I really want, or is it much more about seniority, or what have you found there?
Well, there's a lot of things at play. There's personality. There's industry. I mean, there's all different things that, sort of constitute who we are and how we think and how we operate. But for the most part, I think we have to just recognize that we're, to ask the question, what do you want? And see what happens. Be really cognizant of what happens, because with some, they absolutely don't know what they want. And to your point, Leo, in some cases, people feel that they don't have the right to even want something different. Right. Some people, I've had people say to me, Laura, I've never been asked that question in my life. What do I want? And so the first time that it's asked, that's horrifying. I can't tell you how many times I've had people say that it just scared them to be asked the question. And so how did they get confident in that? They got confident in just being able to have the conversation, the dialogue and the conversation about what they want. And this is where, we can really help people find their way into where our organizations are going. So that if we declare where the team is going, where the organization is going, and then asking individuals what they want, and be very cognizant of their first reaction. Some will be fearful. Some will absolutely be clueless about what they want because they've been tethered and actually focusing, and they have incredible clarity on what they don't want, but they have little clarity at all. And others have been wishing silently that someone would ask. And so when you ask about the differences in generations, and that's we've done a lot of generational work, but that specific question is a unique one. The millennial generation in particular is dying to be asked because they have thoughts. They are lingering there, but there are so many prevalent stereotypes that are being propagated about them.
Right.
They're just hushing up about it. Why would I say what I want just to perpetuate the idea that I think I should get what I want without paying my dues? Why would I articulate what I want to have people, think the worst of me, or look at that and think that I want to be the CEO of the company tomorrow? And so they have learned to quiet that voice, because if it's an ambitious voice, and depending on the lens that you're looking
right.
through, one person is looking through if you're looking through the lens and you expect someone to be entitled and to think that they should be promoted before they do their, all the work necessary to get there, if that's a lens that you're looking through, pretty much anything that comes through their mouth is going to look like, you're entitled, aren't you? But imagine if you had a different lens and you were saying, just being curious. What do you want? What does it look like? Because the truth is that we really forget how naive any one of us were in the beginning. We all started off naive, right? I mean, think about any of us before we became parents. It's like, how many times would you look at others and think, I would do that differently? And then you find yourself in the space, you find yourself on an airplane with a kid ready to, go absolute, and you realize it is a bloody hard job, right?
No question about it. I mean, you speak to curiosity, which I think is, a real key here, because part of it is trying to get understanding among these generations. And these generations were shaped by very different circumstances in terms of, how they grew up and what was happening in the world, and how it shaped their view of where and how they fit in society. So how do we break down these barriers in the workplace? Because these generations have to work side by side, and they have to be effective, and they've got to work together. So what have you seen that's effective for breaking down those barriers, so that millennial isn't concerned about answering that question about what do I really want, with fear that it's going to be taken the wrong way? Right.
Well, we find that it's really critical in the beginning to find a common ground. What is a common ground that you have with someone that is different than yourself, which could be a generational differences or a multitude of differences, but where do we have common ground? And the reality is that most of us have common ground someplace. Most of us, whether it is, overcoming adversity, family, travel, food, you name it. Find a common ground. This is a place where we really stand on the same ground. That's a starting place. 2 is to come from that place of curiosity. Imagine yourself, if you're meeting someone and you look at them and you can see that they're being critical of you in some way, shape, or form. And people think that others don't see that, but of course they do. Sure. And so these looks and they feel it.
Yeah.
You feel it. They think that others don't know. I can't tell you how often I'll speak about this with audiences, 300 people in the audience, and I'll say, they can read this in your eyes. And I'll look out and I'll see a half a dozen people with a look on their face like this, like, you can't see it. And I'm like, I'm seeing it right now. I mean, this very moment, your face amongst 300 other faces, I see it. So when we're on a one-on-one, of course people see it and sense it. So the starting place is be curious, and curious without judgment. Just imagine that person is strong and capable and powerful and has great things that they're going to contribute, and then come from a place of curiosity, find common ground, and then really, like, one of the things that I say is great leaders are not struggling with the younger generations at all. You want to know why? Because they recognize that we're all different, and their leadership is such that they want to understand, who is this person? What are they really passionate about and interested in? Where do their strengths lie? What are their values? And how can I help them take those assets and really contribute positively? And when we operate in that way, then we recognize we've got an individual that we're working with, not a generation, not a stereotype, but an individual. And great leaders have always recognized that and have always utilized that communication. But if we expect people to be like us and we look through a lens that says all kinds of negative things like being entitled and not hardworking, in our conversation earlier, Leah, I was telling you I had a conversation just this week. And I brought up millennials, and this was a very senior leader. And I hardly got the word out of my mouth, and he goes, I have a problem with those millennials. I have a huge problem with those millennials. I've got a couple nephews. If they only knew how hard I work to get to where I'm at. And then he began reflecting back on his life, and he said, well, I started off my life as a surfer. In fact, I didn't really get serious about my life until I was 40 years old, and I wasn't even talking. And then he goes, I guess there's not so much difference there as I realized. And it was such a fascinating exchange because I didn't hardly say a word. I mean, he kind of came around to his own conclusion.
Sure.
But I think it illustrated something we have to be really cognizant of is we've got knee-jerk reactions that are happening now, and they are spilling forth without any real evidence on our own that it's true. And I see this a lot. I don't have any real evidence. In fact, I did a session not long ago, Leo, and a leader came to me afterwards and he said, we were talking about finding common ground and coming from a place of respect. And he was hot and bothered when he approached me. And I have seen this many times before. He said, you've asked me to respect someone that is entitled. And I said, have you experienced that before? And he said, I've heard about it. And I said, but have you experienced it?
Sure.
And I said, tell me about your kids. And then all of a sudden his eyes soften and the look on his face completely changes. And so, there's a really important example is that these knee-jerk reactions and the messages that are being advanced in the workplace and in the marketplace and in the media, that we're leaning on those rather than our actual experiences. Or if we have one bad experience, then we're sort of pasting that across everyone. And I think if we would honestly look back at our friends, we would say, yeah, there were some that just didn't get it. They were clueless. Every generation has had people maybe that just didn't get it. So what if we shifted? And the way that I like to think about this, Leo, is imagine that there's an organization. And that organization has said, you know what? We're going to look at this differently. We're going to believe that our greatest opportunity lies in leveraging the power of generations. That's where it's at. What if we believed, and every single leader within the organization operated with the belief that we're going to leverage the power of sage wisdom with the insight and technology and fresh legs that the younger generation brings, and all generations in the workforce. And we believed that we could bring those things together and we could innovate and we could be more change adaptive. What if we made that our mantra, our way that we operated? And I will offer that organization down the street will have a distinct advantage over any other.
Over the years, there's been so much about diversity of all kinds and in all ways, in the workplace, and yet not enough about how to really leverage it, how to really talk to one another, how to really learn and how to be curious and how to do so without judgment. And I know a lot of your recent work is really about creating that learning mindset and getting teams to really work together to understand that there's something to be learned from every individual in that room. Everybody has a different set of experiences and perspectives to bring to the table that we can all really get great value from if we just decide to ask the questions and really listen and care about the answers.
Right.
So in terms of that learning mindset and a lot of the work you're doing today to create that in organizations, what does that look like? How might you describe that for our listeners today?
We've got a project that's beginning right at the first of the year. And there are 25 intergenerational teams that are beginning on a process. One of the steps in our Creating a Mindset for Change program is what we call high beams on research. And that,
back to the cars.
Back to the cars. We'll reference back to those cars, right?
Yeah.
And so each individual member of these peer teams engage in their own individual research on a weekly basis, and they commit to that research, and some are doing it a little bit each day, some are using kind of an hour or so on a given day. They have the opportunity to define how they do that research, but independent of one another, they're doing research on one of the 4 drivers of change, that being technological advances, global connectedness, generational shifts, demographic shifts, I should say, and then changing consumer and employee expectations. So those are the drivers of change. And then any given month, they maybe even further refine their research, but independent of one another, they're researching. And then they're gathering together as a group. And their job in coming together is that it is collaborative. That means that they're there to create something that wasn't there when they started off. That's the expectation that they establish. So they are peers. They are from, representative of all generations and other diversities on these teams, and have been divided as such. And really, we're talking about across departments and everything, because you might say to yourself, gee, it's, when we talk about differences, we don't have to get very far from the home team to be able to see, to see differences and for biases to come into play. We see that all the time. And so these groups have been defined around all of those, and they're brought together to collaborate. So that's a great example of an organization that's truly leveraging the power of generation, the power of differences to learn and to be in dialogue and conversation with the idea that they're going to create something. They're going to collaborate and create something that wasn't there before. We're here to help one another, learn from one another, and kind of make sense of what they're coming across. Because the sense making is important, because none of us have all the answers. None of us could really predict what the next 5 or 10 years is going to look like, how industries will be changed.
So it seems like that creating the right environment for collaboration is key. We are social beings. We are social learners. We want to do it, and oftentimes we just don't always have that mechanism or that place to go or that group to be part of or that team to be part of that allows for that level of collaboration. Is that fair?
I think that it's absolutely true. And I think, it begs the question, well, what's really getting in the way of that? And one of the things that we found is that post-2008, the vast majority of teams and organizations are flatter and leaner than they ever were before. In other words, there's less people doing more. So what does that mean in terms of how I operate? And how others in organizations operate? It means that they're flying by the seat of their pants from one meeting to the next. They're mired into day-to-day tasks. So it's very hard to eke out that space. And then by being mired into day-to-day tasks, we don't have our high beams on, once again, back to that reference. We're not paying attention to how the marketplace is going. What we're paying attention to is when our next meeting is going to be on the calendar. So we're not looking up, we're not reflecting, and we're not having those collaborative conversations.
Yeah, we really need to create that space for sure. One of the things that we've actually talked about over the years is, and I think the latest numbers I've seen is U.S. corporations are spending about $130 billion on training and executive development. And yet the environment is that they might go to training for a couple of days and then come back because the organization's lean, they're super busy, they got all kinds of stuff to do. They're catching up on the emails they missed while they were gone on training. They get sucked back into all of the of what's going on in the company, and there's no mechanism, or at least too often, no mechanism for saying, what are the 2 big takeaways we got from that 2-day learning experience that you all thought was important enough for us to attend? And yet that tends to get lost. Now, all of that great learning never finds its way into either individual or team practice, inside of an organization. And I'd like to hope that we can get better about creating those collaborative spaces that you're talking about, so that as we learn new things and as we can agree as a team, boy, this is something that will make us better. How can we hold ourselves accountable for doing that and implementing what we know is so powerful? I just think it could be a good step.
It would be a good step. So you bring up an excellent point. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that's spent on training and the retention that's there. So there's a couple of things that come into play. I mean, our brain doesn't exactly support the process, right? So if we don't have reinforcement in that learning, the vast majority is gone within a few days. It's gone. So we have come to accept that. We keep throwing money and resources and time at training and accepting that reality. And then the other piece that comes into play, which even worsens that situation, is what you described, is that we get back to our desk and there's 250 emails and off we go, and we don't even think about that training again. So I think that's something that we've got to look at, honestly. And I think there's a unique opportunity to leverage the power of that human interaction, as you described, and be very distinct and planful and, strategic in how we leverage that human side and create those small opportunities for interaction and collaboration. And I also believe that we can lean on the technologies, and we can lean on I'll speak to, we do what we call microlearning, video microlearning, short bite-sized stories and coaching that are spaced over time. So people can sneak them into their very busy day and either deepen the learning or create the opportunity for that dialogue and conversation with a colleague when we're walking down the hallway. And that's how we operate today.
Well, it seems too that one of the big benefits I see of that also is in the example I talked about, where you go off to your 2-day learning event and then go back to work. This is where we separate the learning from the work, the learning from the doing. And
Yes.
What you're talking about with microlearning, if it happens in the context of your day, and with it tends to, it would seem to me, integrate it more closely. So now that learning and work starts to become closer and more connected.
I think that's a really excellent point. And like you said, it is, and there's value for going away too. So I don't want to dismiss that, because sometimes when when those experiences are so close to the workplace, it's hard for us to really connect with those, right? So I think that there's value to being in a
Absolutely.
different. I really do. I think of my best and most creative ideas actually do not happen at this desk. They happen on an airplane, or they happen in another location. So there's something to be said for those spaces. And yet at the same time, how do we bring learning in closer to the work? How do we nudge it into our actual day? Because from that standpoint, our mind can begin to say, this applies. And that's one of the things that we have integrated into our process, is that in a small bite-sized video learning, we follow that with self-reflection questions that say or ask, how does this relate to you? Where have you seen this in your work? What are the applications? Who could you have a conversation with about this to deepen your learning, right? So that's the other thing that's lacking, that self-reflection, that little piece of time where I say, I saw this, it caused me to think a little bit. How about if I reflect a bit? What are the implications? And that's another thing that we're not doing, we're not reflecting.
I think the point you made also about the offsite that is really important also is it is a place where instead of just getting to know someone as a coworker, you get to know them as a human being.
Right.
We get to know one another as people. We start learning that, oh, you have 3 kids and you have, a relative that lives somewhere where my mom grew up or something of that nature. And you start creating all of those, various connections, which can be really powerful. I guess my whole thought is simply that doing that is so valuable, to your point. If we could only then bring that and not have it be so event oriented and bring it into our workplaces in a way that gives people a mechanism for being able to take that learning and really make it work for themselves and for the organization.
Here's an interesting piece, because I couldn't agree more. And what we really believe is there's a unique opportunity to leverage those live conversations with an online microlearning. We can bring those together in a very strategic way. And really, like you said, we put it in action. We take what we gather in an offsite. Like you said, we get to know that someone also likes microbreweries. We get to find those common ground, right? We find that common ground, and then we continue that. I was working with a group one time, and we were talking about how poor retention was. And this was a senior leader learning professional. And she said, "Oh, I know that the retention is poor. The only reason I do it is for collaboration." And I thought, that's fascinating. Why don't you bring them together to collaborate then? Or why don't you consider either that training or that collaboration to be a great place to start, but no place to stop? And that's really the message that we say, is that we are social beings. So get together, collaborate. I don't care whether it's training or collaboration or social. It's a great place to start, but it's no place to stop. And really, when it comes down to the neuroscience of learning and real change, it's undeniable that it takes time. It takes time, and we've heard all of the notions, and I don't know that any of us can really be certain about how long it takes to make change. You hear the whole stories about 21 days to form a habit. Most of us could, tell our own stories of how we, fell off that track before with 21 days. But by giving people the opportunity to continue to have the dialogue and conversation, that's really key. In fact, many of our best clients, that's what they say, is that these small micro learnings create a conversation that continues. They give their employees a shared experience. And we lack a shared experience today. I mean, we used to have a lot of shared experiences. On Saturday night, when there were only 4 television channels in 2 decent shows, if you ran into a friend the next day, the likelihood that you could talk about that shared experience was pretty high.
Yeah.
Now think about it today. I mean, we just don't have that. Even if your very best friends are watching the same series on Netflix, they're on a different episode than you're on. They sat down and binged the entire series when you're only on number 3.
Right.
And so you really don't have that shared viewing experience. You don't have that chance to sit down and talk about things. I mean, there's very little of that, but this gives us a chance to all have a shared viewing experience, which lends to the conversation, and it keeps it going.
Well, I know we could continue this conversation for hours, as we often have. And but what I'd love for you to do, I know obviously you're a keynote speaker, you're a consultant. There's so much that you're doing and so much value you're delivering. I'd love if you could just let our listeners know where they can learn more in terms of your website or any other information you want to share about how they can learn more about your work would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Well, our website is GWT Next, and that stands for Global Workforce Transformation. We're really focused on being those keen observers of where the challenges lie and creating tools that help organizations more effectively manage change and prepare for the future of work. So our website, to make that and nowadays we've done that. We've created this GWT Next list on Twitter. We have a regular paper that's published with, research from some of the larger organizations, as well as messaging from futurists, economists, demographers, people that are out there, paying very close attention to how the marketplace is changing. We've got a magazine. And what does that do? That makes that research a lot easier. So that's a quick and easy way to connect. And then, as I mentioned, we're really focused on creating microlearning lessons and microlearning programs. We're very proud of this and excited about the fact this has been a long, hard journey for us, because we were very early to market with these types of tools. But I'm proud to say that the technology is supporting this, and that wasn't there to begin with, and so is marketplace adoption. And so those organizations that really want to get ahead of this and want to have the right mindset and be prepared for change, not when they're in the midst of a crisis, but on the front end of it, are really benefiting from having these tools be a part of their larger solution, their larger strategy to ensure that they're successful now and into the future.
Well, Laura, keep those high beams on and continue all the great work you're doing. Thanks so much for appearing on the Year of the Peer, and look forward to connecting with you again real soon, I'm sure.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Enjoyed my time.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us today. To learn more about Peer Advantage, to submit questions to Leo and our guests, and to subscribe to the Year of the Peer podcast, please visit us at leobottary.com. It's leobottary.com. This podcast is produced by me, Randy Cantrell, hosted, of course, by Leo Bottary. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod, Vibe Ace, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license.